being responsible for your mistakes and your successes, that's like it's a power to be able to take control of that, because if I'm the one who messed up, that means I'm the one who can fix it, right? I don't have to wait for someone else to come along and fix the problem for me. And I think that's the problem with victimhood narrative, or the victim mindset always has you sitting back waiting for someone else to fix your problems.
You must be some kind of therapist.
I am some kind of therapist, and I'm about to take you on a journey through the inner wilderness. I've invited brilliant guests from all walks of life to join me as we investigate, illuminate, and inspire transformation in ourselves, intimate relationships, and the social ecosystems we are constellated in. What you are about to hear may surprise you, so hang on to your earbuds for a hefty dose of sanity in a chaotic world. I am Stephanie Wynn, a licensed marriage and family therapist, branching out and building bridges between psychology and everything else under the sun. It's my honor to have you along for the ride. Let's get started. Today I'm excited to welcome Adam B. Coleman. We met on Twitter, and he has oftentimes posted some really thought-provoking threads. I was interested to pick his brain. Adam B. Coleman has written for Free Black Thought, along with another guest I've had on the show before, Michael D.C. Bowen. His blog is at wrongspeak.net, and he also wrote a book called Black Victim to Black Victor, and he has his own kind of wounded healer's journey around fatherlessness and the father wound. I don't know when this episode is going to be published, but we actually just had Father's Day yesterday, so this topic is on my mind as well, as somebody who has a father wound that I've gone through my own healing process with. So I'm curious to see if we explore that topic, as well as the topic of your book and blog. Adam, welcome. I'm excited to see where this leads.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So where should we start? I'm curious if you want to kind of introduce what your book and your writing is about, or if we should start with the fatherhood stuff. I mean, admittedly, I haven't read your book, so there could be a lot of overlap there.
There's definitely overlap. So we can just start with the book. The book came about after the death of George Floyd. And it was in reaction to the reaction of George Floyd that made me want to eventually sit down and write about my thoughts when it came to race. That was the original premise, was just to talk about race. But the more I wrote, the more I was trying to highlight different things that we aren't talking about when it's surrounding race or the perspective of race. So, the most important aspects of the book is revolving around family. Outside of what the media thinks of racism being the number one issue affecting Black Americans, if we're just looking at Black Americans, the number one issue is family dysfunction, especially when it comes to not having fathers within the home, not having access to those fathers, especially from the child's perspective. And I wanted to use my personal story of growing up without my father, being very open and honest about my feelings about my father, not being there, how it made me feel, and also being critical of my mother's decision to choose that kind of man to have a child with, to have that particular lifestyle, which she had chosen, to not get married, to not be in that situation, have a marriage and a nuclear family, to raise children. And I wanted to be critical of that mindset, along with talking about other things, other ideological things. So the book is called Black Victim to Black Victor. And the central premise is, yes, talking about the victim mentality, what leads into it and things like that. But it's a mixture of things. It's a mixture of talking about family at its core. It's a mixture of talking about the mentality, ideology that a lot of Black Americans subscribe to, that were raised into thinking, that were raised into believing. It's not an overt political book or anything like that. There may be some things that people may not agree with, which is perfectly fine, because the book wasn't made to convince people. It was made for me to express myself. And if people want to read it, I appreciate they read it. If they like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. But thankfully, I think even if people don't agree with every little thing that I say, which is perfectly fine, they at least understand where I'm coming from. They at least understand that I'm writing this because I care, not because I'm angry or pushing some political agenda or anything like that. My central premise of what I talk about a lot is talking about family, it's talking about children and the protection of children. So yeah, I think what started off with wanting to talk about race ultimately went back to the core of everything, which is family.
Hearing you speak about this, there's an authenticity and a vulnerability that's coming through. There's a softness in you, there's a realness there. And just at first impression, without even having read this book, I'm getting the sense of how much more personal this is to really look at your pain and your community's pain and what's ailing in your community from the standpoint of something that can hurt so much as family and loss of family and conflict in the family. I mean, I'm a marriage and family therapist, right? Like, this is vulnerable, hard stuff to deal with. And it seems like, as upsetting as ideas like systemic racism can be, they're also really impersonal. And they give you something where you don't have to necessarily confront the painful, powerful emotions that you feel toward looking into your loved one's eyes, right?
Yeah.
Or the longing that you feel when they're not there. It's, it's easy to kind of project onto the idea of a system, of something so much bigger than you, something impersonal, your anger, your rage, your self-protective feelings, and not have to deal with that wound as much. And it almost makes me wonder, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but like, if that father wound that's at the core of some of what you talk about, if that father wound gets projected onto institutions as a way of kind of protecting oneself from that vulnerability.
Yes. Part of me wants to say that a healthy father figure wouldn't let their children behave like victims. And so when I'm seeing a majority of a demographic that grows up without their father, at least in the home consistently, that's a problem. Even if it was half, that's a problem. And so when we talk about from the ideological standpoint, for someone to ignore their responsibility and ignore their personal responsibility when it comes to their actions, how they grow up, how the decisions they make, the choices they make throughout their life, to divert it to something else for their failures, seems like someone who grew up without a father figure to tell them to be responsible for their mistakes, to own up to what they do. And that's what I see a lot of the times. The willingness to divert all issues to something else, something external. When I'm clearly looking at people, and when I say people, I don't mean like an entire demographic, but I'm looking at certain people who are espousing particular things. And I'm like, well, your life sucks because of the decisions you made. Like, you didn't need systemic racism to make your life worse. Like, you contributed to the outcome of your life. And what I see, for the most part, that is destroying Black Americans' progress is poor family planning. Like, without a doubt, being a single parent is basically flirting with poverty, if not being within poverty. Statistics show that single mothers have no wealth. We like to make this picturesque idea of this strong, successful woman who's making near six figures and taking care of her two kids by herself, and she could do anything, and she's superwoman. But the reality is, they're often check to check. The average Black woman makes less than the average Black man. If most of the Black mothers are raising children by themselves, they're single income earners. Even if they're taking in child support, that's still not the same. That means that they're constantly flirting with poverty. That means that they're constantly living basically an economically mediocre lifestyle. So when people say, oh, black people make less money than white people, I'm like, well, that's household income. What's a household like when there's only one person versus two? You know, I had a conversation with a relative who was more so on the, let's talk about white supremacy type thing. And he respects where my position is. And I said, let's say you're right. Let's say everything you're saying about white supremacy and its behavior is there and it's affecting our lives and it's affecting our society. It doesn't help to have a bunch of children out of wedlock, does it? Did white supremacy tell you to recklessly make children? No, you did that on your own. And you couldn't deny that what I'm saying is true, right? If there is this existential threat of white supremacy all around us, right? That means that we need to be extra careful with how we move about in our lives. So it does us no good to be sexually reckless. It does us no good to procreate recklessly. Like, that actually makes your life worse, with or without white supremacy. So I'm in this book, I'm not trying to say that white supremacy doesn't exist or anything like that, because it's a moot point to even talk about, to be honest. And other people will argue whatever. That's not necessarily the point of the book. The point of the book is to talk about the issues, the real issues that people can actually change for themselves. You have control over your body. You have control who you have sex with. You have control over who you marry, whether you decide to marry or not. These are all things that you have control over personally, which means that if you do it in an incorrect order, if you do it in a wrong way, then you are the one who is responsible for your failures, not a system, not something that's invisible, nothing like that. You're the one who should be accountable for your actions. And I just want to highlight these things because I don't think people really see it this way, or the people who are saying what I'm saying aren't saying it in a way that is palatable.
Well, it's common sense, isn't it, to take control of what you can take control of. I think the higher the stakes are, the more we kind of snap to it and live that reality. Like, I'm thinking about driving as an analogy, right? When you're behind the wheel of a car, you know that you have life and death in your hands, right? And that if you're in an environment where it is so dangerous to drive for whatever reason that you just shouldn't get behind the wheel of a car, then hopefully you're gonna figure out a different way to get around. I learned this the hard way, that I've decided from now on I do not drive in foreign countries, because once upon a time, driving in a foreign country, there was a road engineered in a way that they never would have done it in this country, and I almost died. Um, you know, and otherwise, if you're in an environment that is safe enough to drive, you still always have to be vigilant. Even if there's no other cars around, a deer could jump out in front of you. But if you're in a city, you never know if people are drunk, high, like they are here in Portland behind the wheel half the time. Also here in Portland, we have what I like to call suicidal pedestrians that just walk out into traffic without even looking. When you're behind the wheel of the car, you could scream all day about how irresponsible other people are as drivers or pedestrians or bicyclists, but you're the one who's in charge of the steering wheel and the gas and brake in your car. And that is how you keep yourself and other people as safe as you possibly can. And if someone's going to be a total maniac, then you could be the safest driver in the world and still get into an accident. But ultimately, other people are going to make bad driving decisions, and you're the one who still has to do the best you can to keep you safe. It's just practical. And I think that most of us who drive and are reasonably sane, we know this intuitively. And we know that when the stakes are that high, you rise to the occasion. But I think that the stakes don't always feel that way in day-to-day life when we're not really flirting with danger. And yet the consequences for the decisions people make, as you're saying, they're real. They are life and death in the sense of your relative success or failure as a person. You're like you talk about flirting with poverty, right? These are very real things. And yet when we're not brought down to that level of earth, it's really easy to blame other people and systems and powers that be. I just want to share one more analogy while it's on my mind too, is like, I think about animals and nature. Like, I care about the environment, and it's tragic that, many species are facing extinction and that there's a lot of destruction of their natural habitat. But if you are a mama coyote waking up one day in your tiny little pocket of disrupted habitat, you don't spend your day being a coyote that's upset about humans destroying your habitat. You spend your day navigating the habitat that you're in and helping your little coyote pups learn how to navigate that habitat too, because at the end of the day, wherever you are, wherever you're born, whatever circumstances you're in, fair or unfair, that's the environment that you have to navigate. So it's just practical, what I hear you saying, right?
Yeah.
And I think that being practical is an act of self-love. It says, I matter. And the quality of my life matters enough that I'm not going to waste my time and energy being upset about things beyond my control. I'm going to accept my circumstances as a starting point for deciding, what do I do with my circumstances? How do I improve my lot in life?
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel when it comes to this particular scenario. It's taking control of what you can take control of. Actually, the way I like to say it is, it's a power, right? Being responsible for your mistakes and your successes, that's like it's a power to be able to take control of that, because if I'm the one who messed up, that means I'm the one who can fix it, right? I don't have to wait for someone else to come along and fix the problem for me. And I think that's the problem with victimhood. The victimhood narrative, or the victim mindset, always has you sitting back waiting for someone else to fix your problems. And it also allows for saviors, people with savior complexes, people who are ready to, almost in a very condescending way, come along and help you because you're a poor soul. And in the context of race, this is my biggest issue that I'm seeing today, is a level of condescending behavior when it comes to Black Americans, directed at Black Americans. And what's even more troubling is Black Americans, or at least some of them, aren't catching on to it, aren't seeing how this is kind of condescending what they're saying, that they are the ones who need to do for you because you can't do for you, right? They don't see it in that in that particular perspective. If I was to say it, in a way that Black people don't need white people to make them successful, they could do it themselves. That sounds like a somewhat of a pro-Black statement, but that's a reality. Like, I don't think Black people are any different than anybody else. Why can't you do what you need to do to excel? Why are you waiting for someone else to do for you? And the thing is, when I say these things, people don't really hear what you're saying, and they hear what they think you're saying. They think that I'm saying that the reason Black people aren't doing good is because they're incapable of doing, or something of that nature. And I'm saying, you're more than capable. You just need to do it, right? You're saying that Black people are lazy. No, I'm not. I'm saying that we have been conditioned, we have been raised in a particular way that has become socially acceptable for us to sit back and wait for someone to treat us with respect and do certain things for us, to beg for reparations, as if that will change anything. When most of people's troubles are things that they can control, right? How are you going to change the world when you can't even change your own environment? You are not in control of what's going on. You're making mistakes left and right. And yet you think that you can influence the rest of the world? You can't. And so I just want people to be the masters of their own domain. And if you want to add a racial context to it, then yeah, Black people, be the masters of your own domain. Take control of what you can take control of. Don't wait for anybody to do for you. Don't wait for the government to do anything for you, because guess what? You're going to be disappointed. Don't wait for the magical white person to come along to do something for you like, why? Just do for yourself, and I think it's become so troubling to see the level of acceptability to have the savior complex, that this is actually what I'm writing about very slowly, but I'm writing about it in my second book, which is going to focus on the savior complex and the prevalent nature of the savior complex that's happening today. I don't think anybody talks about it enough, or they occasionally say, like, that's pretty condescending, and they move on. That's why there's oftentimes I've written articles talking about this. I've written articles, actually my last article that I wrote in the New York Post, I talk about ideological saviorism that happens, and it's directed at us. And no one says anything about this. And it's infuriating. And I think it's extremely insulting. Yet I'm the one who's a racial traitor if I point this out. If I point out that there are people who look down upon us, yet we're supposed to rely on them. Like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah, it feels sick in my body when you talk about that patronizing attitude. And I love that you're writing a book on the savior complex. I think we don't talk about that enough. I have to ask, so I mean, when you talk
Yeah.
about social trends that you see as being condescending to Black people, I've heard some of what John McWhorter has to say about that, and it's very on point. It's hard to find fault with. These school standards. I just hear about this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to believe, right? Some of what you hear, this idea that math is racist and that the way to improve outcomes for Black people is to lower the standards of how kids are graded or what they're expected to do in school. I mean, to me, that's just blatantly racist and condescending. It's saying
Right.
you're not capable and we feel sorry for you. So we're just going to give you a participation award and call it as good as a trophy. And then I'm
Right.
thinking, well, what are the long-term impact? I mean, where does this lead? So I think about self-esteem, right? Like, what happens if you're the kid who you're Black and you got an A, but it was supposed to be a C. It's like how secure would you feel in a job if you knew that you were just a quote unquote diversity hire? And then it's like, okay, so then either these kids are going to grow up to just expect that the world's going to cater to them and not hold them to any standards. And then that leads to pretty dysfunctional personalities and damaged relationships, which you care about. Because, like, if you want to have a good family relationship and a good love relationship, then you have to have some personal responsibility for that. Or, either the world keeps treating these youth these way as they grow up, and then, they're not actually qualified for their jobs, and then it holds companies back from progressing, or then they don't get the jobs, right? Then the rest of the world actually, the standards actually kick in and they haven't had to meet standards. And so, I mean, it just seems like a setup for failure, and it seems so blatantly condescending. So since this is something that's your area of expertise, I mean, what do you think about this idea that school standards should be changed as some sort of like anti-racist maneuver?
Like you said, I think it's extremely condescending. I also think that what's ultimately happening, especially when it comes to schools, the downfall of the education system for all of our children will be blamed on Black people. That's ultimately what it comes down to. We must get rid of honors classes because there's not enough Black people in them. So we need to lower everybody's standards so that Black people can artificially live up to whatever standard they think should be set. And that, to me, is extremely detrimental. And I think what I'm trying to warn people is that the worse things get by patronizing Black Americans, by pretending that you are being supportive of Black people and doing the best that you can to uplift them by lowering everybody else, the more that people are going to become resentful of Black people, as if this is all our fault. And not all of this is our doing. There are obviously Black people who like this particular thing because they see it from the opposite lens. They don't care, right? All they see are numbers. All they see is that there's a discrepancy with how many exact people are in each exact position. And that's not how things work in the world. Like, you can't, I keep wanting to say this probably every other day. Black Americans are 13% of the population. We are not 50% of the population. It's this expectation that we are to always be represented in every which way, and we should be damn near half of the population in whatever you think we should be represented in. The statistics are that I think it's about 62 to 65% of Black Americans live in only 10 states, right? And you can name those states by the cities. We live in very particular areas, and we tend to live together. Outside the 10 states, the other portion is spread out the rest of this country. We are a racial minority. And so when people have these expectations that we are to fill, there's not enough Black people in X, well, like, what do you think is actually happening? And you think that, actually, my question is always, how many Black people do you think should be here before you think that there isn't discrimination, right? And they don't ever have an answer for that. Like, I would have more understanding if they think that there should be 13% of Black people in literally everything for there to be equality, but they don't actually say that, which tells me that they don't really have an answer. All it is just the activity of doing it, not actually finding a resolution, not actually finding a way for there to be this equality that they're actually seeking. They're seeking the adventure of uplifting Black people and not actually uplifting Black people. And those are two separate things. You know, the savior complex doesn't actually care about the outcome. It doesn't actually care about the person that they're saving or supposedly saving. They don't care about the victim. The victim sees the savior as someone that they need, but they despise needing. It's a mutually beneficial relationship, but at the same time, a resentful relationship. Yeah. And I don't think people understand it in that particular way. One other thing I wanted to bring up a quick story. There's someone I don't know. I'm like, it's a weird relationship as far as friendship goes. He's I would probably say he's a leftist. And one time I told him, I was like, don't you think it's kind of weird with all the amount of Black people that you see in commercials, right? Now, I didn't say I have a problem with Black people being in commercials. I didn't say that, right? And so later on, he brought it up with me, and he laughs hysterically. Like, when he sees a Black person in a commercial, he laughs. And I said, why are you laughing? And he's like, I remember that conversation where you were saying that there's too many Black people in these commercials. I said, that's not what I said. Growing up, like, and this is the thing that it's infuriating. I think we act like Black people were never in any sort of influential position, were never actors, never in commercials, never did anything. And then all of a sudden, in the past 3 years, thank God, these people recognize that we were missing from the conversation. We've always been there. And my point to him is that all of this started right after George Floyd. Are you not seeing what's happening here? Are you not seeing that they want some sort of social currency for being the good people by artificially uplifting Black people more so than they normally would, more so than they naturally would? And to me, that's kind of condescending. Like, when all of a sudden it happens like that, where everything is about, oh, we have to do stuff for Black people. When Amazon says, we have to put labels for Black businesses. Yeah, because we have to get more people to buy. Like, they're creating this right. It's trendy to create an artificial environment where you're pretending to help Black people. And whether it actually helps Black people is not the point. We don't know if it does, it doesn't, right? Just because you see some more faces in TV commercials, does that really help Black people on a whole, or does it help a select few? And that's the thing that my friend doesn't understand. I'm not complaining that there's Black people in TV commercials. That's stupid. What I'm complaining about is that this is weird. It's weird to have someone look at people and say, you're a person of color and you meet our quota because we want to uplift you. So we're going to select you over this person, not because of your talent, not because of your skill, not because of anything else. I mean, you're good enough, but especially because it's that kind of thing that my friend doesn't understand. It's condescending. It's condescending to look at people in that way.
Okay, so you made a few points there that I want to touch on.
Yeah.
So you talk about ideological saviorism and how saviors and victims need each other in this resentful way. I'm curious if you have gotten very familiar with the Karpman drama triangle.
No.
Okay, it's what you're talking about, right? It's the triangle of victim, rescuer, and perpetrator. And they all need each other, right? You can't have any one without the other two. And I think that it's fascinating to study it in that way because you see that it's the three of them together that make up drama, right? And it's easy to idealize the role of the savior or of the noble victim and to, vilify the idea of the perpetrator or persecutor. But they're mutually reinforcing, right? You talk about how the savior doesn't actually care about the outcome of the victim. And I think many people with the savior complex would scoff at that and feel wildly offended and say, of course I do. but it's that, well, if there were no victims, then your life would be devoid of meaning. Like you
Right.
need victims in order to reinforce your sense of self. So where is this leading? In my conversation with Jake Wiskershin in episode 2, he said, my job as a therapist is to create a world where I'm not needed anymore. Like I would happily switch over to running a brewery or something if I could just live in a community that didn't need therapy because people were healthy and happy and they had good relationships. And you talk about this idea of representation and your observations of it, especially coming up after George Floyd. So I want to talk about both of those. I mean, you talk about how Black people are 13% of the population, and isn't it strange that there's, comparatively this kind of overrepresentation in media that seems like it's kind of a pandering, tokenizing response to a trend. And a lot of that trend starting with George Floyd. Now, of course, we had Black Lives Matter protests before that. We had, Breonna Taylor and all these different names and all these kind of waves of outrage over stories of victimhood. I think it's particularly interesting that of all the victims of police violence that could have been chosen, they really chose George Floyd. And George Floyd, if you look at the life that he had, like this man was not living a good life, right? Like a long criminal history. And, it's not to say that there was no injustice in what happened, but it's like, of all people to paint murals of, I live in Portland. We have a lot of George Floyd graffiti murals.
I'm sure you do.
And it's like this is the Jesus now, the crucified Jesus, the the noble Black victim that we must always remember. This is the representation that's being chosen now, and like that in itself seems condescending. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And also when it comes to representation, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this popular idea that you need to see people who look like you. Have you heard this refrain a lot?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, my thoughts are yes and no. Like I get that, right? We all need role models. We know we need people who are relatable. But I hear this a lot in the world of therapy and mental health. And I think that there's kind of like a healthy or reasonable range of the expression of that idea and its implications. And then I've seen times where it seems like people are taking it way too far, as if the only people who matter are people who look like you, and as if the individual has no responsibility to find commonality. Like, I mean, I'm looking as somebody who doesn't look like me right now. You're a Black man, I'm a white woman, but like my life is enriched by seeking common ground with you. And aren't all of our lives enriched by seeking common ground with other people? It seems to me like xenophobic and overly simplistic and just not very deep or wise to just assume that you should teach people that the only people they should trust are people who look like them. It also seems kind of dangerous because if you're equating who you should be able to trust or relate to people who look like you, what about the wolves in sheep's clothing? What about the people who look just like you? I don't care if it's race or age or, whatever the demographic is, but what about the people who look just like you? who are the bad guys they're going to use that, appearance of someone you should trust to manipulate you. So I just see so many flaws in that. And I know I threw like 8 different things out there at you. So take your pick of where you go with that.
Actually, I'll take it from the last point you made, the wolf in sheep's clothing. So I have a chapter in my book called The Ivory Tower Black Elites. And the point of that chapter is to talk about people who are the most economically privileged, right? Some of them are the most economically privileged, no matter what demographic, but they're the most economically privileged Black people likely that have ever existed on this planet, right? Yet they are willing to basically sell out Black people as a whole and use the stories of lower class Black people to gain an advantage and gain a popularity, to find some sort of association with what it means to truly be Black, right? There are wealthy Black people who see typical Blackness as being associated with poverty, as being associated with struggle, right? And so if you're a Black person who grew up in a nice neighborhood, went to a private school, went to an elite university, and now makes six figures plus, like, where was your struggle, right? Are you truly Black? And so I'm being empathetic to a degree for someone who might be in that particular situation, but the problem comes into play when they take this weird association and they become weirdly exaggerative and almost go way too far when it comes to identifying with people simply because they look similar to them. So, in my last article I wrote, I'm primarily talking about the Washington Post columnist Jonathan Capehart, who wrote this article called "Black People." This might not be verbatim, but it's something close. Black people are scared of crazy white people, right? That's the premise of the article. And so the article, and I'm someone who looks deeper than what is written. The article shows basically Black people are in constant fear. They're in constant fear of white supremacists, right? His reasoning comes from a single poll of 800 Black people that they had interviewed 7 days after the Buffalo supermarket shooting. And it's a Washington Post Ipsos poll, which he's part of the Washington Post. I have questions about their selection and how they found these Black people but let's just say it's all copacetic. It's a very small subgroup of people. It's a very small sample size of people. Then he uses a person because he says, well, Black people can't even arm themselves, right? With a gun. He says, I talked to an average Black man, right? And it provides a link. And he says, what's the point of owning a gun? Because we won't be treated equally. You click on the link, and the link brings you to a guy, the average Black person, who's a podcaster, author, right, so on and so forth. This is a media guy. This is not your average Black American, your average working class. But they don't know the difference, right? They don't know what the average Black person is. They don't care. Right? It's just whatever feeds into the narrative. They don't go any further than one step. And to add insult to injury, why someone like myself, a Black American, shouldn't even bother about arming myself and protecting myself with a weapon? Well, Philando Castile. So Philando Castile got shot by the police while legally owning a firearm. So what's the point of me even doing that? It is a fear-riddled article being written by, I don't know his finances completely, but I would guess near 1% of income earners, right? And it's this crying and this exaggerating about what it means to be Black as they live a life of a 1%er. That is something that is the wolf in sheep's clothing that is happening a lot today. These media pundits, professors, you name it, they don't want you to recognize that they're very wealthy, very well off, yet they're screaming oppression. And when working class people say, hey, what's that about? Especially if it's working class Black people, I'll tell you this. I've been public for about a year since my book came out. I put that article out. I got 2 random messages calling me a coon and, and all this other stuff, right? Which, by the way, I find to be hilarious because now I get to use their ignorance and put it on display. And I have the audience to poke fun and pick apart how flawed their thinking is. So I have no problem when it comes to stuff like that. But that article is what triggered them. That article triggered them because I defined what white supremacy is. I define white supremacy as the constant viewpoint of Black people being these victims who are incapable, who can only do things if benevolent white people allow them to do it or the government is involved. That, to me, is the white supremacy that's happening today. So moving forward, if someone asked me if I believe white supremacy is real, I said yes. And I'll explain exactly what I mean. They don't like that I said that. As a matter of fact, one of the people who did call me a coon, I engaged in a conversation with them. And based off of what they're telling me, and granted, this is the internet, they could be lying. They live in New York City in a penthouse and drive a BMW. They are the economic elite. They do not like when you say these things and you're a working class Black American. And for me, I don't care anymore. I really don't care. I think we should really talk about the link between class and race, because they don't want you to recognize the class part. They don't want you to see that, hey, how come you got ahead, yet this invisible system of white supremacy didn't stop you? But you're the loudest person talking about white supremacy. Why is that the case? And my assessment is that it's kind of 2 things. They didn't have struggle. And so they're holding on to this concept of Black struggle. It's much like Colin Kaepernick when he came out with that Netflix series, right? He dresses like a 1960s revolutionary Black Panther, afro and pig, like it's cosplay for Black revolutionary. That's basically what it is. He had no real struggle, right? Granted, he was adopted, but he was adopted when he was very young into a upper middle class white neighborhood and grew up in a relatively good life, made it all the way to the NFL with some hard work and perseverance, just like anybody else who makes it to the NFL. Yet he cannot help himself but to hold on to some sort of Black struggle. And this guy is a multimillionaire because of it. So, it's one of those things where I have to point out how ridiculous things are. I just put on Twitter today, it was a table full from MSNBC, table full of Black women who are, professional activists, highly paid activists, Joy Reid, a highly paid pundit, you name it, all influential figures, actresses, Black actresses, they're all Black women who are griping about being oppressed because their makeup artists don't know how to get their skin tone correctly or prepared for it, or how their hairstylists don't know how to do their hair properly, as they're literally drinking wine and laughing. They are so void of how that looks. And so that's the thing that I want to talk about a lot. I want to talk about the Black bourgeoisie. I want to talk about how they are the wolf in sheep's clothing, who conveniently are Black when it suits them.
How are you sleeping? Sleep is a foundation of mental and physical health, equally important to nutrition and exercise, yet it's often the first thing to go during times of stress. Good sleep can help alleviate depression and anxiety symptoms, maintain a healthy weight and metabolism, protect your heart, and even reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. Yet still, 1/3 of Americans struggle with sleep, and temperature is one of the main reasons. Before I got an 8 sleep, I was already an expert in sleep hygiene and practiced what I preached to my clients. But I would still wake up overheated in the middle of the night and unable to fall back asleep for 1 or 2 hours. Adjusting the air temperature and blankets was not enough. The mattress itself was keeping me hot. But now, I'm sleeping soundly through the night and waking up refreshed thanks to my 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover. The Pod Pro cover by 8 Sleep is the most advanced solution on the market for thermoregulation. It pairs dynamic cooling and heating with biometric tracking. The cover can adjust the temperature on each side of the bed individually for you and your partner based on your sleep stages, biometrics, and bedroom temperature, reacting intelligently to create the optimal sleeping environment. If you'd like to be more patient with your children, more emotionally stable with your partner, a fitter athlete, or more efficient at work, take it from me, a mental health professional. Improving your sleep is one of the best investments you can possibly make in your overall well-being and the lives of everyone you touch. Go to 8sleep.com to check out the pod and use the code SOMETHERAPIST at checkout to start sleeping cool this summer with up to $200 off your purchase. Even if they're already running another sale, this code will get you an additional $50 off. And yes, to my listeners around the world, 8 Sleep currently ships not only within the USA, but also to Canada, the UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. All right, now back to the show. As you were saying, they have no struggle. I found myself thinking, or they know a thing or two about success that they're hiding from people who could use that information, right? Because, like you say, there are Black people who are very successful and well off, whether, some of them might have been born into wealth and probably had a safer and more abundant upbringing than I did, for sure. And, others of them might have worked their way up. And in any case, whether you were born into wealth and therefore you had good, a solid family structure, probably your parents taught you about investing, they educated you well. If you're born into wealth, you know a thing or two about being successful. And if you had to work for it, then you know even more. And it seems to me almost like one could easily perceive kind of a stinginess in, let's say being a Black elite wealthy person who's choosing to, be that wolf in sheep's clothing, pretending that you have the same struggle as some working class inner city Black family, when actually maybe you could uplift other people by sharing the wealth by saying, hey, well, first of all, number one, I'm a success story. I'm an outlier of the myth of the Black victim because look, I have a great life. I'm grateful for my life. I have it better than a lot of people of a lot of races. Like, good for me, And number two, let me share what I know. If I care so much about my racial group or whatever my tribe that I associate with as like my people, which, some people really feel tribalistic about their racial affiliation or their nationality or whatever. Like, if I care so much about this group that I affiliate myself with, like, and I have some success, how can I share that? What can I teach? And the thing is that nobody who's stuck in a victim mentality makes it very far in life. You don't make it to that level of wealth. Now, if you were born into wealth and you're spoiled, for lack of a better word, then sure, maybe you have a victim complex. But, to maintain good health and wealth and a happy family and all of that, you do have to have some good habits in place. And why would you not use that to help other people? But instead, I get the sense that like they're getting some kind of social capital, that their fame and their popularity is being increased not by being generous with their knowledge and resources, but by playing into the meme of the day, the trope of Black victimhood, and just aligning themselves with it.
Right, exactly. I've said multiple times on Twitter, actually, I think it was like a week or so ago, talking about the American dream, what the American dream's to me, and how I was able to overcome a bunch of different obstacles, being homeless, having to move back home with my mother multiple times as an adult, losing my job, all these different things, car repossessed, all these different things, to the point where today I make an above average income, and I just purchased my first brand new car in over a decade.
Congratulations.
And thank you. I was able to do all these things. And this wasn't me bragging about it, because I'm just saying, if I can do it, I don't think I'm that special where other people can't do what I did. And I told them exactly what I did. I built myself up. I gained more in confidence. I stopped with the pity parties, and I focused on building skills. I focused on building my skill set. You become more valuable in the job market that way. And that's what anybody can do. And whenever I talk to people who are considering doing things, whether going to college or whatever, I talk about these very things. I'm not a millionaire, right? And I don't think most people want to become a millionaire or even close to a millionaire. They just want to have a sustainable lifestyle. If I am someone who's making above average income, can easily tell people and give people unsolicited advice, take it or leave it, yet these people can't even give a hint or even suggest or insinuate that there is a pathway to make it to the point that they did, that is why I think they're all suspect when it comes to this. That is why I think on a deeper level, it is about competition. I've heard from people within corporate America who talk about stuff like this, who are there are two Black people there now instead of the one. And that one Black person isn't competing against everybody else. He's competing against the new Black person that's there, right? There is something about it. I haven't fully picked it apart, but there is something there about keeping that minority status, about keeping that illusion of the accidental success story. That, oh, how did I make it? I just ended up here. The $1 million in my pocket just magically appeared one day. We know how they did it. We know that they were able to do it, and like you said, many of them built themselves up. You become a college professor, you become a tenured professor, you become on national television, you're making buku bucks. Like, I hope you're mentoring people. I hope you're showing people how to get to that point. And maybe they are behind the scenes and we just don't know about it. But I find it insulting if they are doing it behind the scenes, that they're going ahead and preaching to the public that there is a system that's put in place to keep people from succeeding.
Mm-hmm. That brings us back to something you mentioned earlier about this trend of kind of teaching people to live in a constant state of fear.
Yeah.
And I wonder about your thoughts on kind of the costs and benefits of that, because if I presume to know nothing about what the facts are, what the data is, and I'm just coming in this completely naively, just thinking about a situation where a group of people is being taught to live in fear. They're being taught messages about some potential danger. So I'm not going to make any comment on what the statistics show, any of that. What are the pros and cons of that, right? So we can consider that the more real and present the danger and the more accurate the message about what that danger is, the more important that knowledge becomes. Because, yeah, you're definitely going to want information like, if you're camping, you're going to want to know if there are bears in this area. That's important information, right? The more that information is being exaggerated or distorted, the less helpful it becomes. And this is one of those things where, approaching it from a mental health standpoint as a therapist, I help people with anxiety all the time. And it's like there's always a mixture of truth and imagination in any fear, unless your fears are completely psychotic or you're a small child and you think there's a monster under the bed. I mean, most of us, our fears have some basis in reality, but they're exaggerated or distorted, or the way that we're thinking about and processing those fears is not helpful, right? Like being aware, for instance, going back to the driving analogy, being aware that there are maniacs on the road, and maybe even having some specific information, like being aware that late at night people are more likely to drive drunk. Helpful information. Being aware that there's a typical speed trap where a cop parks at that particular intersection. good to know, right? Like, then you can plan for it. Then you can take appropriate precautions. And that's one of the reasons that fear is helpful. Fear is there to inhibit us from doing something foolish. Sometimes it means you need to change a plan entirely or to refrain from doing something. Sometimes it means you need to go in with a different, a plan B or some kind of protection or strategy. But there's also fear that's not helpful, or a way that we react to fear that just makes things worse. Like, going in with so much anxiety that you create a self-fulfilling prophecy, projecting your fears onto someone and creating a much more negative relationship than would otherwise be necessary. Avoiding things that could be beneficial for you just because there's some amount of fear, that just the fear of trying new things, social anxiety, stage fright, fear of whatever, you name it. There's a cost benefit analysis at which our fear just stops us from doing things that are good for us, right? And so, this idea that the world is out to get Black Americans, whether the world be like this idea of white supremacy and institutional racism that's just everywhere, or whether it's the idea that like cops are going around just massacring Black people, like these myths about how much fear Black people should be living in all the time. Again, going in blind without even looking at the data. Where do you think any of those myths or facts or whatever are helping people, like leading to, more informed decision making, more strategic choices, appropriate precautions? And where do you think they're just hindering people, creating paranoia, dissociation, holding people back, creating kind of a constant state of vigilance, damaging relationships?
To be honest with you, I think today I don't see any real benefit. I think we're at the point of being just completely hyperbolic. And add social media to it, it makes it very easy to create a vision of the world. Even through like Twitter, for example, you can create a very narrow tunnel of problems to be vigilant about and to be concerned with. The narrative of danger for Black people, like you said, there's always some truth when it comes to anxiety, being paranoid about something. Maybe you're a little bit too paranoid. Maybe you're a little bit too cautious, right? So there's definitely like a balance between the two. My problem is the exaggeration is far too common. The narratives are far too common. You know, Twitter is a great example of how rage is driven on there. And for example, police shootings. Let's police involved anything, especially if it's involving a Black person who's being affected. I personally don't even watch them anymore, right? Because they're so rare and they're so complex. You know, especially when it comes to police shootings and anything revolved around the police. I think Americans are willfully unaware of danger. I don't think they truly understand what it means to be in danger. I think some of them do. I think some people live in dangerous neighborhoods and actually understand what danger is like, but not from the police. Are there bad police out there? Sure. Are there police officers who've gone too far? Absolutely. But I don't think people understand what it means to be a police officer who is also in danger, who is also living a life of paranoia, who, you know, I believe police officers have one of the highest rates of drinking for a reason. They see things that most people don't see. And they are told to react in this perfect manner 100% of the time. I just got done watching a video the other day of a police stop. The guy's just talking to a person. Someone pulls up in another car randomly out of nowhere, gets out with an axe and starts chasing after the cop, and the cop has to shoot him, right? This is something you can't prepare for, that some crazy person is going to ride up with an axe in his hand and try to kill you. And this is the type of scenario that could happen to a police officer. And I don't think people understand that level of paranoia that they have to live. Yet they're the ones that we are constantly scrutinizing, constantly trying to say, well, why did he wait a split second here, then shoot? But then he, like, Could you imagine being in that scenario? Could you imagine being in a dark alley? You're scared. That person's scared. You see something you thought you saw, you shoot. I'm just making stuff up, but there is no understanding when it comes to that level of paranoia that they might have to go to. And I'm not some police officer apologist. I'm not really apologist for much of anything. I'm just trying to use common sense.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand where people are coming from. The narrative around police shootings, I think, is so exaggerated. I think it's so ridiculous. And I remember at one period in time in my life where I kind of was buying into it. And I can't remember what year it was, but there were a couple of shootings that had happened, or police involved incidences that had happened in America that, where 300 million people live. There were a couple of police incidences that had happened in America, statistically possible. But I had gotten pulled over and I remember shaking. I don't have any drugs. I don't have any weapons. It might have been for speeding or something stupid like that. Why am I shaking? And it's because I was believing the narrative. It was in the back of my head. And that is a problem. That is a problem, that if we're being trained to be so vigilant, that we're paranoid, that we're scared all the time. And now what I've become very aware of is how they're using Black people as they're using them as a way to manipulate the public. If you can make Black people scared, then any type of solution that you say is for Black people will shift the conversation, shift the narrative, shift the purpose. You can shift whatever you want. And that's one of the big things that I like to talk about, is the manipulation that's happening. You can say that it will benefit Black people, and you can literally do anything politically. Even if it doesn't. You can claim that changing this will affect voting for Black people. Even if it doesn't, now we must do the opposite. Now we must do this. That will benefit Black people. Even if it doesn't. Like, it doesn't matter if it does or doesn't. You just have to say it does. And that is the level of power that has been taken away off the backs of Black people, off of being able to manipulate Black people in this country. So I'll go back to, is there systemic racism? Yes, now there is. And it's become mainstream. And that's the problem.
Wow. I really appreciate some of the points you brought up about the trauma that police experience. I find it a little bizarre that some of the people who are the most obsessed with the idea of trauma are also the least sympathetic to how trauma might actually play out for police officers. By the same token, it's the same people saying Black Lives Matter that are saying all cops are bastards. And it's like, so does a Black cop matter, or is a Black cop a bastard? Like, it just doesn't logically add up, right? And I think you bring up some good points, and I want to say, I will reveal this about myself for you and for the listeners. I have been wrongfully arrested and mistreated by police on multiple occasions myself. Like, I've probably had more personal experience of this than a lot of people who are out there talking about police brutality. So I was wrongfully arrested multiple times as an adolescent, as an activist. I was out there at those police brutality marches. I was out there doing these like far left radical protests. I didn't do anything illegal, and I got arrested multiple times, and I got mishandled. Those charges have been dropped. I was also wrongfully arrested as a victim of domestic violence when I called the police on an abusive partner, and I was arrested. Again, I had that charge dropped and the whole case wrapped up, and it's off of my record now, which is part of how I feel comfortable to actually speak freely of it, because it's official that I've done nothing wrong, But even as someone who was really, really mistreated myself, I still have sympathy for what it's like to be a police officer. I see where some folks are coming from. I've had clients who were either, police officers or aspiring police officers, although I think it's really difficult for police officers to trust therapists for a number of reasons. And it's not to say they don't have their problems, but a lot of those problems do come from the trauma of doing that work. I also learned a lot in college from a professor of anthropology, cultural anthropology that I had that was great. And I think I talked about this on a previous episode. So for listeners who listen to every episode, I apologize if this is redundant, but I had a professor who early in her career had been approached by a student who said, "Hey, you know a population you should really study? The LAPD." And she immediately, all of her biases came up and she was like, "Oh no, cops." And she found herself reacting. And then she went, "Huh, I'm a cultural anthropologist. Looks like I just discovered a form of bias that I have. I should check that out." So she ended up doing a 20-year cultural study on the LAPD, becoming part of their community, writing a book on them, marrying a cop. I learned so much from her. But I appreciate people who check their biases. And I think it's ironic that, again, the people who are obsessed with the idea of checking your biases themselves have a bias, and it's a bias to look for racism and oppression and all these things in a very specific way that fits their narrative. And they don't realize that that itself is a bias because that's what you're looking for. And that might actually be obscuring your vision from what's really going on. So I appreciate that you brought up the subject of police from a compassionate perspective. I have a couple of other questions I wanted to ask you. So I want to ask about your thoughts on walking on eggshells, because it's my perception one of the ways that sort of wokeness has made racism worse. I don't know if that's exactly how I want to put it, but just bear with me. Is I think that people are so afraid, right? Because of this kind of myth of the Black victim who can do no wrong, who can behave however they want to behave, and all they deserve ever is sympathy because they're a victim of racism, poor them, right? And then the myth of the white persecutor who is only ever valid when they're in the role of being the correct type of savior. And other than that, they're just inherently evil. I mean, these myths, I think, are damaging in a number of ways. And one that I've seen is that people seem a lot less natural with each other. I heard a story of, it's a personal story. I won't share too much, but a story of someone who was a victim of something really scary that happened at the hands of a Black person. And they didn't call the cops because, the way they literally said, "I didn't call the cops because Black Lives Matter." It was like, I was a victim of a Black criminal, but heaven forbid that, I call the cops and they have to encounter the police in some way, shape, or form. I would never be able to live with myself. What if they're murdered? That was the vibe. And I've also heard from, some of the most bleeding heart liberal people I ever talked to who care so much about these issues, but are like afraid to talk to other humans now because of this dynamic that's perpetuated itself. And it just seems like a huge step backwards for progress. So I wanted to know your thoughts on, does it feel like people are walking on eggshells? And what do you think we ought to do about that?
I think it depends where you live. I know you live in Portland. It's very political, very left-leaning. And so, they're very open on their views. I'm sure there's Black Lives Matter all over the place. But I do think that for the people who are living, let's say where you're living at, who aren't that far into, being so overtly political, but at the same time being around other Black people, if they're around other Black people, maybe they are walking on eggshells. I don't think it's far-fetched. We are being told that we're experiencing racial reckoning. We are being told that race relations are at an all-time high as far as being bad. Is that the case? Are we just being told that race relations are bad? that's part of the narrative. That's part of the weaponizing of narratives. That's part of the manipulation, the social manipulation of the media. I wrote an article for Newsweek talking about this, about race relations, about how we view race relations. And, statistically, this is what people think, right? That race relations are worse than in the past 20 years. That's what race relations are. But race relations is a perspective. Like, there's no statistical proof that race relations are good or bad. This is just a perspective. This is just a feeling. My gut is telling me that things aren't good. And why is that the case? Why all of a sudden in the past 20 years are we now feeling this way? Could it have something to do with the form of media that we take in, the narratives that are being pushed in our direction? I think with the combination of being locked down from COVID, no sports, no entertainment, not really any movies being made, nothing like that. All of a sudden, we're being inundated with George Floyd and race and everything racial. And we must always look at race and so on and so on and so on. And that's being pushed and pushed and pushed. And platforming basically neo Marxist Black people who are so identity based, so race driven, and trying to convince white people to become racial as well. It's something that people don't really like. I think normal people don't like this boutique way of living, of being hyper racial and hyper visual about identity and identity politics. That's one of the reasons why I left the left. I left. I stopped supporting the Democrats. I became an independent. Is because I find that the Democrats have become so identity driven that it's unbearable. I fear that Republicans are starting to trend in that direction, but I don't think they're nearly as bad as the Democrats are. Not to be super political, but I'm just saying that I'm a normal American. I don't think I'm that special than anybody else. I'm a normal American. And when I go out to work, when I talk to people, they obviously people notice I'm Black. Like, they're not blind. We talk about having a colorblind society. I think people legitimately think, like, I don't even recognize that you're Black. Yeah, of course you do. You have eyes. You can see me. You have vision, right? By the way, that was ableist of me to say that. But I'm just saying, like, people obviously can tell I'm Black. Like, fine, cool, right? But do you treat me in a particular way? Do you treat me different than other people? I would be bothered if you treated me different than someone else simply because I was Black. I'd rather you treat me different because I'm Adam, or you think I should be treated differently or treated better than somebody else because that person's a jerk and I'm nice to you, whatever it may be. But I think, the average normal American who isn't hyper partisan, who isn't hyper political, they don't like having to be forced to see identity 100% of the time. And I think it's extremely detrimental when you try to force people to do that. And I think what I'm watching today is a pushback against it. That's what you saw the anti-CRT movement is basically, from what I can tell, this is just my perspective, I would say most of the people were apolitical. Most of the people were apolitical. Actually, I'll just put it like this. If I was to do some sort of math, I would say 50% of the anti-CRT movement is apolitical. I would say 25% were former Democrats, 25% Republicans, which is right down to where voting is like. Voting is pretty much like that as far as voting demographics. But a lot of apolitical people became political. They didn't like race being pushed in the particular manner that it was being pushed within their schools to their children, alongside the gender stuff too, which was a big motivation factor. So I don't think most people like it, but nobody really cares, especially in the media, because there are, for the most part, behave and act like elitists who know better than the dumb American who, just middle America, flyover country. They don't know anything about anything. But we're the educated people. I went to the elite university. I know what's best. I studied the books. It's that kind of elitism that we're seeing today. But I don't really see any good about being hyper racial, because it's stuff like this. Your friend was in danger, and they shouldn't be ashamed to report someone simply because they look a particular way. That's allowing for wolf in sheep's clothing to exist.
You talk about wanting to be seen as Adam, right? And I think that's what we all want. I mean, obviously, stranger in a coffee shop, not going to know what makes you unique, but I, it seems like there's a double bind where we're simultaneously being asked to treat people with dignity and respect and being asked to see people as an identity that is almost entirely, at least up front, focused on their demographics. And it's like, well, which is it? How am I gonna be curious to get to know Adam if I've just trained myself in this intersectionality way of thinking that, well, Adam is a black man from a middle he went from a working class to middle class, and he's a father, and he lives in what, Jersey, right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Like if I'm thinking of you in terms of your demographics, I mean, it's very uncreative. There's no individuality in that. But then it also entails that there's some kind of code for how I'm supposed to treat you, right? Because I think it's the same people
Yeah.
who are so fixated on demographics are also fixated on these narratives of the victim, perpetrator, rescuer. And, if I'm seeing you as a set of identities, as a racial identity, heaven forbid that I claim to be colorblind, or heaven forbid that I don't assume that that's the most interesting thing about you, or that I don't make a set of assumptions, right? Because the story it's like, okay, if I'm following this line of thinking, I'm supposed to see you as a black person, and therefore as someone who's had a really hard time in life, and it's all the fault of people who look like me, and you are owed everything, and you owe me nothing. And then I'm like, what? I'm like, before I meet you, I'm like automatically like groveling, I'm indebted, I'm apologetic, like I and then if it's acceptable, if the color of your skin means that it's acceptable to be angry at the world all the time, and to have a view that is very cynical of people who look like me, I'm white, therefore I must be racist, I'm part of the problem, I'm antagonistic toward you. If that's an assumption that you are supposed to carry because of your demographics, then it's like our amygdalas are just firing like crazy, right? Like the fear center of the brain, the most primal instinct is just like threat, 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 right? And then you can't think, you can't proceed calmly, there's no genuine warmth possible for our interaction. There's no humor, bonding, commonality, exchange of kindness that's possible there, because I'm immediately going to, how do I placate you? You're a righteous victim. You're entitled to be angry at me. You're entitled to hate me because I'm the bad guy. I am apologetic for my existence. How do I appease you? Right? Like that is such a trippy power dynamic that,
Yeah.
and then the only way that I could be any semblance of kind in that interaction is if I'm this kind of false sweetness of, well, we call it fawning in the understanding of trauma, right? So with trauma, you have the instinctual reactions of fight, flight, and freeze. Fawning it's not as quick of an instinct as freezing or having an adrenaline rush to punch somebody or run away. But fawning is kind of this learned behavior that's more advanced as human beings, where when there's a threat, we placate. It's more manipulative, it's more complicated, but something I've noticed from people, including my own past experiences, but also working with people who have been in abusive relationships, is that when you're accustomed enough to having love and fear mixed together, to thinking, I love this person, but I'm also scared of them, you develop that kind of Stockholm syndrome. You actually don't know when you're fawning anymore. It's not like it's not like we're always conscious when we're trying to placate another human being. Sometimes we behave as if we love someone when actually we fear them, and then we can't actually tell the difference. And this can make it hard to leave abusive relationships. And I feel like that's what's happening in race relationships right now. Like, there are a lot of well-meaning white bleeding heart liberals who have swallowed the current narratives about what it means to be anti-racist,
Right.
and then they have love and fear mixed together, and instead of having any like genuine interracial relationships, there's just fawning and placating, and it's got to feel condescending and awkward on the other side. But it's like, what alternatives are there if you're adhering to these narratives? Like, how do these narratives make room for people to actually like have comfort and mutuality in their relationships?
Well, you don't adhere to them. That's a simple answer. I think it's hard for people to veer away from what's common, to veer away from what it seems like everybody else is doing. To stick your head out in fear of being hammered down. But I think it's incredibly important for people to question things, question everything. I actually want to go back a little bit. You had mentioned something, the bleeding heart liberals. In my book, and I'm still dissecting it a little bit, but in my book, I kind of, in the book I'm working on, let me just say that. I'm working on trying to dissect the savior complex, at least the modern savior complex that we're seeing. And I basically identified two groups. So the first person is, I didn't really give it a name, but basically the first concept of the savior is someone who knows exactly what they're doing. They are narcissistic. They genuinely don't care. They're in it for the attention. They're in it for the applause. They don't care about the outcome. They will say whatever to appear as righteous. Right? There's that person, and I also find that person tends to be the person who is driving the action, who's the administrator at a school to start this anti-racism thing. It's that person, right? But then there's the other person who has been, I want to say, swindled into becoming a savior, who has been convinced that the answer to the things that they care about, because they are a compassionate person, but their compassion has been utilized in a way to make them almost like useful idiots for this cause. And so it's that kind of like hierarchy between the two that, like you identified them as bleeding heart liberals, have now become basically narcissistic progressives. That's kind of the best way I can identify them. And I know these people, and I have one particular person in mind, someone that when I was a Democrat and I identified as a Democrat, and from a political spectrum, I was never a progressive. I was always basically a moderate liberal, but I was also very, like, I guess, pragmatic, So I wasn't overly ideological, but my biggest flaw was that I trusted the media. Just whatever was on TV, I would take that information, I trust it, and dissect that information from there. So I was good at dissecting the information and making a decision for myself. The problem was that I was getting bad information, and I didn't go any further than that. That was my major flaw. Once I left that mindset and started seeking information for my own, and left the mainstream bubble and started going all over the place and just talking to people just in general, that's when my world sort of expanded. But one particular person who I was pretty close with, when holidays, I would go to their family's house, hung out, cried on the phone with me, would have personal conversations with me. And I want to say we had a friendship for a couple of years. And I remember at one point, we were laughing at the woke, right? We were laughing at their behavior, and they sounded ridiculous. And it was after George Floyd, obviously during the pandemic, they started changing. And granted, I started changing a little bit because I had left the bubble, but they were changing in their way of their nastiness, right? They were compassionate, but they were nasty about it, to the point where it was no longer compassionate, it was ideological. And I was like, this isn't the same person. And we had a blow up, and I'm the type of person like, are we friends or not? If we're not friends, just tell me, and I'll leave you alone. Like I don't care either way. I don't beg for anybody to be my friend. But we had a little bit of limbo, and some months went by, and then we finally had a phone conversation. And it was the first time I talked to her on the phone in half a year. And I'm talking to her, and I'm like, she sounds exactly like them now. It was like the machine had grabbed her and injected the anti-racist stuff. It was almost like, the thing about people who are like progressive anti-racist, they're so predictable. You know exactly what their answers are because it's ideological. It's not even a viewpoint. It's like your friend said, because Black Lives Matter. Like, that's the answer. The answer's always there. It's not a thinking answer, it's a provided answer. That's what she sounded like. And I remember one particular point where she said, well, I just listened to what Black people are saying. And I said to her, I'm Black too. Right? But it was like that went over her head. She could not understand, nor did she want to listen to my perspective, even though she was claiming to listen to Black people, but willfully ignoring the Black person that she's actually talking to on the phone by providing an alternate viewpoint. She did not care.
It's crazy.
She had turned into a completely different person. Her compassion got weaponized and used, and now she's been convinced and turned into a savior when we no longer talk anymore. So it's that transformation. I've talked to so many people. That exact transformation, the exact characteristics of being compassionate, being heart liberal, whatever you want to call them, transformed into this anti-racist progressive who is ideological. Like that's so common. I've talked to people all over the place, throughout the United States, in the UK. It was just like that. After George Floyd, everything changed, and I find that extremely interesting.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. If you like what you're hearing, now's a great time to like, subscribe, follow, rate, review, or share. You can also support the podcast by visiting sometherapist.com/shop, where you will find goods and services I have personally curated to support your well-being and enrich your life. We're just building the shop, so check back periodically and feel free to suggest recommendations. All right, now back to the show. It's heartbreaking to lose an old friend like that. I actually have a similar story. So I haven't shared much of my background on my podcast, at least not all at once. I've shared little bits and pieces. People get glimpses into my past. But I actually grew up in a primarily Black neighborhood in LA, and I was bullied quite a bit for being white. Like, I was called slurs, I was threatened, I was beaten up. So I had a very different experience than the current than anything that fits the current narrative. And I've had a whole journey that I'm not going to get into right now with how that influenced how I've thought about historical and current issues. One of my best friends growing up was a Black kid who I grew up with. He was always really friendly. He's just one of those people who's a world bridger. I am somebody who's always transforming. I go through different phases of, hanging out with these people, hanging out with those people. I don't always hold on to people from my past, although if somebody reappears 10 years later, it's like, hey, how's it going? But I'm always kind of shifting. And he's one of those people, in contrast, who's kind of always been the same person and is very loyal to his childhood friends. He's in touch with, people we went to middle school with. But he was one of my best friends, and he was safe, because I was being picked on, and he was my best Black guy friend who helped me find a safer daycare facility than the one I was getting beaten up at, and like would just always stick up for me, and I would stick up for him. And so it's precious when you've had such a strange life like I've had, to have somebody who knows that chapter, the chapter that nobody else is going to see, because people see me and they have the assumptions that they have about who I must be and where I've been or where I haven't been based on what I look like. People don't assume that I like grew up in like a working class Black neighborhood and that I have experienced racially motivated violence like more than like a like affluent Black person who grew up in a safe neighborhood in a 2-parent household, right? Like that doesn't fit
Right.
anyone's narrative. So, to have a friend like him, he was like one of the very few people I stayed in touch with from childhood. And like we didn't talk that often. I mean, we went years without talking, but then he was like just a loyal childhood friend. And I thought, him, if anybody, like he was there, he knew what happened to me. And for years we could talk about it. And it was like, so it helped with my sanity to have him as a touch point, to be able to talk about what that was like for both of us growing up. And I had a similar kind of disintegration of our relationship within the last year or so. When I was starting to get this podcast going, I had reached out because he had wanted to get into podcasting for a while, and I was like, "Hey, so and so, I'm getting my podcast together. Like, do you have something you want to talk about?" And he said like he had something to say about quote unquote white feminism, and I didn't quite get where he was coming from. And this was just an email exchange, and I said, okay, so like just so you know, like my stance on race issues, like my thinking is more along the lines of like John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes on this stuff. And I have concerns about like modern quote unquote anti-racism. And then he just flipped on me. And it was so unexpected and sad, because he's one of those guys with like a stable temperament, like I said, like loyal to his childhood friends. But then he just completely rewrote the narrative. And it was like, this is not the person I know. Like the person I know is really like fair-minded, peacemaker type individual, like loves everybody, kind of a world bridger, like doesn't get easily upset, tries to see things from multiple perspectives, and like knows my heart. Like knows my heart from when I was 7. But he did that same kind of flip out of like, I was saying something that according to him, John McWhorter is one of those white supremacist Black people. It's this, listen to Black people. No, not those. No, not that. No, that Black. No, these ones. These are the Black people you're supposed to listen to.
Yeah. See, if you listen to me, all I do is validate that white supremacy doesn't exist, and I make white people feel good.
Oh,
didn't you know that?
Thanks for being here to make me feel good about myself, Adam. That's exactly what I invited you here for. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah.
Just fluff up my ego.
That's it. I find there's so many different things that for one, I'm sorry that you went through that with your friend, but like I was saying, you're not alone. Like there's been so many people in the past couple of years, such a very similar story. I plan to actually write a couple of those stories within the book of people who went through very, very similar things. Compassionate people, maybe even somewhat logical, and then just all of a sudden flipped. Now, if you talk to my friends, they'll say that I flipped. And what's funny is I've changed my viewpoints on certain things, but nothing that drastic. I've just become more principled on certain things and less, I would say I've become less ideological. I've been more open-minded to things.
I like that. Can I just say becoming more principled and less ideological? I like that. I mean, that sounds like a shift toward maturity, but go on.
Yeah, exactly. So to explain for the people who are listening, I was what you would call at first a default Democrat. I like to use that title. When I first got into politics, I just became a Democrat, which was explained to me by someone that the Democrats are for Black people, and that's basically the starting point. And so that was always my premise when it came to politics. I'm not a stupid person, I'm pretty analytical, but like I said before, my source of information was basically just one-sided. My viewpoints, and it took a long time to realize that my viewpoints on what Republicans are and what Republicans want came from a left viewpoint, right? So
Same.
it was filtered from the left. And there were a couple of things that I had transformed. I write about it in the book, but I was traveling abroad. I was in Spain. I don't know if are you a religious person by any chance, or
No.
no? Okay. You know, sometimes you look back and you wonder, like, was this like a religious experience?
I am a
or
spiritual
it was
person.
Destiny.
I'm just
Spiritual.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely
Okay.
have experiences of something greater. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was in Madrid. I was there to watch, my favorite team is Chelsea. So I was there to watch a game. The game had just finished, and it went from it being a beautiful sunny day to just torrential downpour. And I had no umbrella, had nothing. I'm far away from my hotel or my hostel. So I was like, you know what? I'll just stay and watch another game. And I stayed and watched a different game, and I started talking to this guy, and he was there with his girlfriend. He was a British guy from Manchester, and he's been living in Spain with his at the time girlfriend for a number of years, and we just kept in contact. And we kept in contact. We were talking about football and everything after I got back home, and really, really supportive and really nice. And then we got into the topic of Brexit, because at the time Brexit was about to happen, or maybe it had already gone through to vote. And he said he was for Brexit. And I thought that was interesting, because I'm like, I thought Brexit was for these racist white people who live in England, who don't want foreigners in their country or whatever. And I asked him why he was for Brexit, and he said almost verbatim, the United States would never allow an outside governing body to tell it what to do. And I said, that makes a whole lot of sense. And he was actually someone who introduced Thomas Sowell to me. I had never heard of Thomas Sowell. And I just became more curious because, you know, I'm a seeker of information, but I wasn't behaving in that way. And when someone makes a compelling argument in just a matter of a sentence, it's like, I don't have everything. I don't have all the answers. I clearly don't know everything that's happening here. So let me just seek information. And that led to, you know, taking in books that talked about things that happened with Donald Trump, which, you know, to this day, I'm not 100% MAGA or anything like that, but it just made for a compelling argument that Donald Trump isn't this insane person who's, you know, the next coming of Hitler. He's a flawed individual who did some things that are good and some things that weren't so good, just like basically every president. But the thing that was interesting was the things that were provable. Like, now I can prove that the narrative that was being set upon him, that they said that he did, I can literally watch a video and see that he did not say these things and he did not do these things. And it was like, when you start seeing that this narrative that they've been pushing for 2-3 years actually didn't happen, and they've been lying to me, I can no longer just default to trust the mainstream media. So, you know, in some ways, yeah, I've changed, but I've changed for the better. I've changed for being more critical of the information that's being put in my direction, being more critical of narratives, even from the right. I was just asking the other day, you know, we're talking a lot about drag queens, and I'm thinking to myself, there's a pattern here. Why all of a sudden are we talking about drag queens so much? Like, who is pushing this narrative? Why are these videos all of a sudden popping up? Is this something that's being created, or is it something that's actually becoming more prevalent? But I want to know, am I being manipulated, right? Yes, it can be disturbing that, you know, these things are happening around children, but how frequent is it? Is it being contrived to make us, you know, to sow more division, to make us more doubtful about our society? Who benefits from this? You know, I'm asking all these different questions. So I'm not just blindly going along with the go along, or believing every politician that says something. You know, I have criticisms about both sides. I am an independent. I am more of a right-leaning independent, but I'm an independent today. It's a shame that I'm being pigeonholed as something that I'm not on an occasional basis, but I think anybody who actually listens to what I say, they understand my perspective. They understand where I'm coming from.
I'm technically still a registered Democrat, but ideologically, I'm politically homeless. And I appreciate what you said there about realizing that your understanding of the right or of Republicans was coming from the left or Democrats, respectively. Because I went through a similar process of realizing that, yeah, everything I knew about those groups was coming from other liberal Democrats. And so I do think it's important to gather information from multiple sources and to kind of be skeptical of who am I getting this information from? How might it be distorted? What might someone else be kind of standing to gain from framing it this way? I have one more thing I want to ask you about. I feel like we've been going for a while now, but my conversations always go this way, or I have an idea, maybe we'll talk about this, and then we talk about everything else. But if you have a few more minutes, I am
Yeah.
curious about these themes of healing the father wound and going from victim to victor. You've touched on each of them a little bit throughout, but I think at the very beginning, you were saying that there are things that children need from fathers. And I'm curious about, within your own journey of growing up without a father and then deciding that it was really important to you to be a good father to your own child, what are some of the kind of key themes of that healing process for you, or what you've learned about really what it is to be a father?
The healing process required therapy. I'm a big proponent of therapy, but therapy in a healthy way, not therapy as a crutch, but therapy as a way to gain tools, gain understanding, and then moving on with your life. So those are two separate things. I guess for me, I didn't grow up with my father, and my struggle was understanding what it meant to be a man. And I had my son at not a young age, but a relatively young age, at the age of 21. And so here I am, not exactly sure where I'm going directionally in life, not exactly sure what it means to be a man. And now I'm a father. And so, I said this publicly before, the only thing I knew about being a father was not to be like my father.
Mm.
So I wanted to be active in my son's life. My son was a big influence for me to mature a little bit more than I was, to become less selfless, to make certain sacrifices. The first 9 months of my son's life, I was just talking to him about this. The first 9 months of my son's life, his mother didn't want to get a babysitter. She was adamant about not getting a babysitter. So I worked overnights, and I would leave work, go to his mom's house, pick him up, and have him all day until she got off of work. And I basically got like 3 to 4 hours of sleep a day. Like I was exhausted. But it was one of the best times of my life. Like I had so much fun raising him. He was such a happy baby. He was a good baby. And I really got to bond with him. And while all that's going on, like I said, I'm exhausted. I'm at a dead end job. And I'm trying to figure out what to do. And, I thought there was an opportunity to learn a skill and do a bunch of things, but it required me to move to a different state for a period of time. And so I had moved just before his 1 year birthday, and I was away from him for almost a year, and it was detrimental for me. It was extremely disappointing, but it was also extremely depressing. I missed my son's first birthday, and that messed me up for a while. And I was so close to him, but I felt like I had to sacrifice in order to potentially, build something for myself so I can provide for him. Because working at this dead end job is a dead end, and I'm not making enough to have a life that he can prosper from. So, there were risks that I was taking that were plausible risks to take. that might have turned out into something. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the emphasis was always to ensure that my son had a good living, had a good upbringing, and understand that I cared. Um, Thankfully, I was only away for about a year. It feels longer than that, but I came back, and I've been with him ever since, and I basically see him every weekend. He lives with his mother, and now he's 16, so he can text me and call me whenever he wants, and we occasionally talk. But my whole thing was trying to trying to figure out what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a father, but also understanding the impact that I had, or I'm not had, but have on my son. I think when you grow up without your father, especially when you look around you and you see that it seems like everybody else has their father and you don't, you're kind of like missing that. Like you know that you instinctually miss it, but you don't fully understand what it means, or actually how it's actually impacting you by not having your father in your life, until maybe later on when you actually take the time to dissect and figure out why. But I think also becoming a father and seeing how I do A and my son reacts to B, and this is the outcome, and I'm like, oh, I'm really influential for my son. I think it was my wife who's told me, like, your son watches you, right? Like, he's watching you. He's literally watching you, not figuratively. He's literally watching you, and it's like, oh yeah, he's always watching me. He has my mannerisms. It's weird sometimes. Like, I do something where I'm stretching, and he'll stretch the same way at the same time at weird moments. Like, so my son is always mimicking my behavior. He's watching what I'm doing, and I'm very conscious of that. One of the influences for writing my book was to leave something behind for my son, and to be vulnerable, and to talk about these things, and talk about my failures, and talk about all these things, to show him that you can do this too. And and to always encourage him. He's going to have his moments where he's feeling depressed, he's feeling down, but I've always had an open communication with him. I've always told him, no matter what it is, you can talk to me about it. If you screwed up on something, just tell me, but don't lie to me. And the angriest I've ever been was when he lied to me about something that he didn't have to, because I'm not a jerk father. Like, let's just talk about it. So it's it's one of those things where I just became the father that I thought I wanted when I was a kid. That was attentive. I'm not perfect, but I try my best to constantly improve. I try my best to hear what he has to say, to give him an ear. I'm always encouraging him to talk to me, to not feel like he has to impress me. Like, I'm always trying to do those things. And I think the father wound is something that healed a while ago for me, especially going through therapy. The biggest thing I learned from therapy was acceptance. I can't change that my father wasn't in my life. I have to accept that. That's what it is. That's my father. These were his decisions. But I also had mother wounds too. I had to accept that my mom is imperfect. When my mom does something that I don't agree with, or whatever, I try not to get so upset, because I expect her to be different. Like, this is who she is. She's done this my entire life. I might not like it, but that's who she is, and I have to accept her. Right? Now, I also set boundaries for myself, and if she crosses a boundary, then I punish it. I don't allow it. But I think it's those wounds that you have to heal, and so many people have to heal it through therapy. So many people have to be willing to point out that there is something wrong. And one thing that I'm very concerned about is the use of ideology to excuse single parenthood, to say that, well, it's no big deal. I see, and I wrote about this in the book, I see feminism as this explainer for trauma for young women. I see it like, your father disappointed you because he wasn't in your life, And here's an ideology explaining to you why he wasn't in your life. Well, it's because he's a man, and men are bad, and go down this rabbit hole. And that's the way that you can legitimize why your father had no interest in your life and chose not to be there. And so now you have resentment and hatred starting from your father, and it's being transplanted onto other men that you interact with, or just even the idea of men. And all they're doing is just manipulating people's personal trauma to fulfill an ideological purpose. And there's always somebody who's at the top who understands these things and takes control of the people who are actually suffering and hurting. I've talked to a number of women who were self-proclaimed feminists, and when they started seeing the flaws and they came out of it and started really asking this question, examining things, and they saw that they were being used to hate men because of their father, the disappointment from their father, for whatever reason, not being in their life. And they held a level of resentment, and they had to heal from those things. And feminism no longer became palatable for them.
The way you describe your take on feminism, and feminism is one of those words that I think is as abstract as the word God. Like, it means so many different things to so many different people. So I don't
Yeah,
comment on it as if it has any one set definition, but I work with, other people's definitions in their social contexts. And,
sure.
how you experience feminism and how you define it kind of reminds me of going back to the beginning of our conversation, kind of coming full circle, because we were talking about something similar with regard to race and institutions, and like how it's easier to kind of shield oneself from vulnerability by, like, as a fatherless Black person, right? Like, by being mad at the system rather than facing the powerful emotions of how you actually feel toward your own father who abandoned you. And this is kind of coming back full circle. We were originally talking about that with regard to race, but now we're talking it with regard to sex, right? And
Yeah,
so, and in doing that, you're kind of turning the tables to, allow me to mirror you, because I mentioned before we started recording that that's something we have in common, is both being fatherless and both having our own processes of healing that father wound. And I absolutely agree that I had a similar process where as a woman who was abandoned by her father, or, similar for women who are neglected or abused by their fathers, that it's easy to project that on the world and onto men and authority figures and patriarchy and systems and whatever it is you want to be angry about, and create some really self-sabotaging patterns, especially if you happen to be a heterosexual woman, right? Because hating men and wanting or needing them at the same time is a really tough position to be in. And I
right.
think a lot of women make very poor dating decisions as a result of that. And for me, I think there was a certain amount of healing my father wound that I had to do on my own to let love in, to find a healthy relationship, and then the healthy relationship that I needed turned out to be with someone who is a father. And he said to me not too long ago, he's like, I think I needed a partner to be a therapist because I needed someone to really try hard to crack me open. Because he's like, he can keep his emotions inside, but I pry him open. And I said, I think I needed my partner to be a father because of my father wound. I needed not to have my own children because that's not something that I wanted, but to have that level of trust and respect for you that can only come through seeing how you embrace that role. And
Yeah,
it is so much more vulnerable to own your trauma as this happened to me, that rather than project it onto the world. One of the symptoms of PTSD, and I'm not saying all trauma is PTSD, but one of the symptoms of PTSD is a change in your worldview, a persistent negative outlook on the world, other people, your future, or yourself, or all of the above, based on what you've been through. And when I'm working with someone who's just acutely faced a trauma, which, I've had actually a few times recently that one of my long-term clients who's, there to work on depression or ADHD or whatever, they go through a major trauma all of a sudden in the course of our work together. So I get to experience kind of the before and after, as well as, of course, people who are coming to me for the first time after a major trauma, but or complex or chronic trauma. But, when when I'm working with someone who just went through something catastrophic and unexpected, it's kind of like, well, if you're a doctor and you're working with someone who just got an acute injury, one of the things you're trying to do is prevent that from becoming like a long-term infection, long-term disability, right? You want to prevent the wound from festering or getting infected, or you want to help the bone set so it can heal properly. And I think similarly with psychological trauma, that part of the job of a good therapist should be to help prevent, allowing that trauma from festering and becoming this chronic wound. And that includes your worldview, right? And it's so much more empowering and healing and powerful, but also vulnerable and challenging to really face all the feelings of what you went through and how that made you feel without carrying it out into the future, projecting it onto other people, because you distance yourself from it by being like, well, I guess this is a world I live in now, or this is how people are, rather than, but to actually experience it as a disruption in a worldview is more powerful, because then you can say, no, this is an aberration. This horrible thing that happened to me is really horrible, and it does not get to set the tone for how I think about other people in general, for how I think about men, for how I think about people of whatever race, no, this happened to me, and the world is still a really vast place where, yeah, I could have a worldview that's influenced by this trauma and I would be correct because I could see evidence that the world is like that. But I could also have a completely different vantage point and that would also be correct because I could see that in the world as well. So I think it's important to kind of prevent that trauma from festering into a negative outlook on the world. And I feel like we just came full circle. I feel like that's like a really beautiful way that it just looped back around.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that you just said. I think for me there is a level of high concern and necessity to talk about what we just talked about as far as the father wound, as far as the importance of fathers, as far as childhood development. I actually, not too long before we got on, I just wrote an article for a publication talking about the importance of fathers. Every opportunity I get, I try to attack certain angles of fatherlessness, single parenthood. I think we have to have a discussion about it, but a discussion about it that is mature. I basically understand that in order for someone to stick their head out and talk about these particular things, they have to be someone who's gone through it. It can't just be statistics thrown out. It can't just be, seemingly political. It can't just be those things. It has to come from a personal place. And that's why I'm perfectly fine with using my story. I'm perfectly fine with talking about what it felt like to be a little boy who plays baseball and sees that everybody else's father is there. The coach's is the father of one of the teammates, but my father was never there. My father was never there. I rarely saw my father, and my mother was put in a position to work a lot. And I want to talk about those things because I think that our viewpoint in single parenthood is of this: women can do whatever they want and be empowered, and everything is fine. But we're always talking about what the mother and the father, and we don't talk enough about the children, what the children are experiencing. How single parenthood is a vulnerability for children. That's how a lot of them get abused. I was just looking at statistics talking about how CPS cases and incidents with professionals, children who are of a single parent who have a live-in partner, not their biological partner, are, I think it's like 8 to 10 times more likely to experience abuse, experience some form of mistreatment, I believe is the word that they use. Like, it's just skyrocketing high. That is a vulnerability to have the non-biological parent live with the children of a single parent.
I'm a non-biological parent living with my partner's children. I'd like to think I'm a good influence, but I hear you.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of everything like likeliness. What are the likeliness? So that's why I think those statistics are helpful. But I obviously, like, they say the nuclear family is the most likely beneficial family structure for a healthy a successful child to grow up in, right? But obviously, not every nuclear family household is healthy, right?
Right.
So, I always look at, when people say these things, they're like, well, my dad was abusive. My mom was like, okay, it happens, but I'm talking about what's likely.
Yeah.
And I think we should talk about setting up our children to be in the best position possible, right? You can send your kids to an affluent private school. It doesn't mean that they're going to become geniuses, right? But you want to put them in the best position to get the best education that they possibly can get if you can afford to, and that's the circumstance. I want people to look at single parenthood or raising children in a way that family structure itself is one of the determining factors to increasing the likeliness they will grow up happy and healthy.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. I had no idea all the places this conversation was going to go, but I really enjoyed talking to you. I feel close to you, and I feel like this was actually a healing conversation for me. So thank you. It's been a pleasure. Tell people how they can find you.
Yes, I'm very active on Twitter, so you can find me at the handle @wrong_speak. People can check out my writings. I've been writing frequently for the New York Post, occasionally for Newsweek and a bunch of other publications. If you go to adamb.coleman.com, they'll bring you to my author page, and you can find out more about me. I'm occasionally speaking. Whenever someone invites me somewhere, I go. I take my mission seriously. If anybody's interested in my book, Black Victim to Black Victor, you can purchase it on Amazon, or if you'd like a signed copy, you can go to wrongspeak.net and purchase it through there.
And that's also where your blog is, wrongspeak.net.
Yeah, wrongspeak.net. I advocate for free speech with intellectual thought. It's kind of the slogan I went with. So I advocate for people to write openly, be critical of a bunch of different things. And if they're looking for a platform to express their viewpoints, feel free to contact me.
Great, Adam. I hope people check out your work. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast with Stephanie Wynn, LMFT. This podcast is produced by Eric and Amber Beals at Different Mix. Special thanks to the talented musician Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. At sometherapist.com, you can find more information on any topic, guest, resource, product, or service you've heard of here today. You can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you would like to ask a question, suggest a topic, be a guest, or invite me to speak, you can email us at hello@sometherapist.com. You can also send us a voice memo with your question, and we just might play it. Of course, just because I'm some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.